My name is Evelyn Harper, 68 years old. A retired journalist living a quiet life in a small apartment in Brooklyn, New York. My days are simple now. Writing my memoir, tending the little garden behind the building, sharing coffee and stories with the neighbors. Peace, after years of chasing deadlines and heartbreak, finally felt like something I could hold. That morning the world was ordinary. Sunlight filtering through the blinds, the faint hum of traffic below, and the smell of burnt toast. I was wiping a coffee spill off the kitchen floor when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer, but I did. "Mrs. Harper," a calm, low voice said. "This is Daniel Weiss from Weiss & Partners in Manhattan. I'm afraid I have some difficult news. Your former husband, Mr. Thomas Alexander Kane, passed away on Tuesday evening." For a moment I couldn't breathe. The rag slipped from my hand, coffee spreading across the tile again. Thomas, the man I had once loved more than my own ambition, the man I had fought with, walked away from, and tried so hard to forget. Gone. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though I wasn't sure to whom. But Daniel wasn't done. "Mrs. Harper, you've been included in his will. We'd like you to attend the reading this Friday at our Midtown office." I froze. My name? In Thomas's will? After 18 years without a word? As I hung up, the silence in my apartment grew heavy, like the air before a storm. That peaceful, predictable life I'd built, shattered in a single phone call. If you're still listening, we want to sincerely thank you for spending your time with us. Truly means a lot. We'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments and let's see how far this message has reached. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, I highly recommend doing it now so you won't miss any of our upcoming stories. These aren't just ordinary stories. They're filled with meaningful life lessons that can inspire, teach, and stay with you long after the video ends. Hit that subscribe button and join our growing community. Back in 1985, life felt like a movie I never wanted to end. I was 28, a young journalist working for the New York Ledger, chasing truth like it was oxygen. Thomas Kane was a rising star in architecture, brilliant, magnetic, the kind of man who could make blueprints sound like poetry. We met at a press event for a new urban development project. He stood there, sleeves rolled up, explaining how buildings could breathe with the city. I remember scribbling notes, pretending to be professional, but my heart was pounding. He caught me staring. "If you're going to quote me," he said with a grin, "at least spell my name right." A month later, he proposed over cheap Italian wine and rain against the window. We had nothing but love and an old second-hand couch. But back then that was enough. Thomas used to draw while I typed. He'd hum Sinatra songs and I'd tease him for being too sentimental. We were partners in every sense, two dreamers who believed we could outwork fate. But dreams can be cruel when they start coming true. By the early 90s, Kane Properties became one of the most sought-after architecture firms in New York. His name started appearing in magazines, alongside photos of skyscrapers reaching for heaven. The man who once fell asleep with ink on his fingers now wore designer suits and spoke in investor language. Meanwhile, my work turned darker. I was uncovering corruption scandals, bribery networks, political hypocrisy. My writing earned awards, but also threats, sleepless nights, and a growing sense that truth came at a price. We were both consumed by what we loved, yet somehow forgot to love each other. Our penthouse on the Upper East Side glittered with chandeliers and silence. Dinner conversations became monologues about deadlines, clients, or city permits. He'd be on the phone, I'd be reviewing notes. Even our laughter, once effortless, felt rehearsed. Sometimes I'd catch him standing by the window, looking out at the skyline he helped create. His reflection looked untouchable, like a man who had everything but couldn't remember what it cost him. Nathan, our son, was 9 when he began to notice. He'd ask, "Mom, why don't you and Dad eat together anymore?" I told him adults were busy, but the truth was simpler. We'd stopped meeting in the same place emotionally. Thomas wanted Nathan to join him on construction sites, to teach him about ambition, legacy, the power of building something lasting. I wanted him to read books, to ask questions, to understand that the world was more than glass towers and money. Our home split into two invisible territories. His empire of achievement, my island of ideals. Nathan wandered between them, confused, silent, always watching. One night, after another argument, something about priorities, respect, the usual wounds we kept reopening, Thomas said, "You care more about your stories than your family." And I said, "At least my stories don't lie to me." That was the last time I saw the fire in his eyes turn cold. A week later I packed my things. No screaming, no tears. Just a quiet goodbye to the life I once thought was perfect. I left behind the penthouse, the art, the designer gowns. Everything except my self-respect. I moved into a small apartment in Brooklyn, the same one where I still live. It smelled of old wood and new beginnings. The first night there I couldn't sleep, so I wrote. I wrote about women who lose everything but still keep their voice. About strength that doesn't roar. It whispers and endures. Thomas and I divorced quietly. No scandals, no public fights. Just signatures, silence, and distance. Nathan stayed with his father at first. Thomas had the resources, the schools, the lifestyle I couldn't offer. I told myself it was for the best. But a mother's heart never really accepts the best when it means letting go. Years passed. I watched from afar as Kane Properties rose higher, as Thomas became one of Manhattan's most powerful names. I saw Nathan appear beside him in newspaper photos, dressed like his father, smiling the same practiced smile. Sometimes late at night, I'd look at their faces in those glossy pages and whisper, "I hope you're both happy." But a small part of me always wondered, had they already forgotten the woman who once sat beside them, believing love could outlast ambition? That's the thing about distance. It doesn't happen in a single step. It happens in silence, in choices, in the spaces between words. And by the time you realize it's there, it's already too wide to cross. The morning of Thomas's funeral was gray and cold. The kind of New York morning where the sky looks like it's made of stone. I stood in front of the mirror, buttoning up a black dress I hadn't worn in years. It hung a little loose now, its fabric faded. It seems carrying the ghosts of another life. As I pinned my hair up, my hands trembled. Not from grief, but from the storm I knew was waiting. The car ride to St. Patrick's Cathedral felt endless. When the driver opened my door, I was met by flashes of cameras, the low hum of conversations, and the heavy scent of lilies. Thomas had always liked grand gestures. Even in death it seemed he wanted an audience. Inside, the cathedral shimmered with wealth. Marble floors, golden light filtering through stained glass, and rows of black suits that smelled of old money and power. The pews were filled with CEOs, city officials, and society women whose pearls whispered when they turned to look at me. And then I saw him. Nathan. He was standing near the front, tall, composed, the very image of his father. His hair slicked back, his suit tailored, his expression carved from ice. For a second my heart forgot to beat. My little boy, once a child who used to run to me with drawings in his hands, now looked like a stranger. When his eyes met mine, something inside me cracked. There was no warmth, no recognition, just cold judgment. He walked toward me, his polished shoes echoing on the marble floor. People turned to watch. He didn't lower his voice. "What are you doing here?" he asked sharply. "After all these years, you still want attention? Haven't you had enough?" The words cut deeper than I expected. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. My throat tightened, my eyes burned. Around us, whispers began. "Nathan," I managed, my voice barely a whisper. "I came to say goodbye." He scoffed, his jaw tightening. "Goodbye? You said that 20 years ago when you walked out on us." It wasn't true. Not the way he meant it. But I could see in his eyes that he believed it. He had inherited not just Thomas's features but also his pride. "I didn't walk out on you," I said quietly. "I walked away from a marriage that had already died." Nathan shook his head. "You always have a story, don't you, Mom? You're the journalist. You twist words until you're the hero." For a moment I couldn't breathe. I saw flashes of the boy he once was, the one who used to fall asleep on my lap while I edited articles, the one who begged me to read him bedtime stories about explorers and faraway lands. That boy was gone, replaced by a man who only saw me through his father's bitterness. A woman beside him, his wife I assumed, placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Nathan," she murmured, but he pulled away. "I think you should leave before you make a scene," he said coldly. The organ began to play. People turned their eyes toward the casket at the front, toward the man they were all here to honor. I looked too. Thomas's coffin gleamed beneath the vaulted ceiling, surrounded by white roses. So this was how it ended. Two lives once intertwined, now separated by death and distance. I took a slow breath and whispered, "I'm not here to make a scene. I'm here to say goodbye, to the man I loved, and to the life we once shared." Nathan's face hardened, but he said nothing. I moved to the back of the cathedral, sitting in the last pew. From there I watched the ceremony unfold, the eulogies, the carefully written tributes, the stories of his generosity and genius. Each word echoed like a foreign language. People spoke of Thomas as if he were flawless. No one mentioned the nights of silence, the ambition that consumed him, or the family he let slip away. I wondered if that was what legacies were built on, half-truths polished to shine. When the final prayer ended, everyone stood. Nathan carried himself like a king mourning another king. He didn't look back. Not once. As the casket was carried out, I pressed my hand to my chest, trying to steady the ache. I whispered to myself, "You've already lost him once. You can survive losing him again." But as the bells tolled and the cathedral doors opened, a chill swept through me. It wasn't just grief. It was something darker, an intuition that this day, this distance between mother and son, was only the beginning of another battle I hadn't yet seen coming. And somewhere deep down I felt it. Thomas's death had ended one story, but it had just awakened another. The funeral ended before noon, but the weight of it lingered long after the crowd dispersed. By late afternoon I found myself standing in front of a glass tower in Midtown, Weiss & Partners, the law firm handling Thomas's estate. The sky above Manhattan was gray and unforgiving, the kind that pressed down on your shoulders and made you question every decision that brought you there. Inside, the elevator hummed quietly as it carried me to the 32nd floor. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirrored walls, an older woman, composed on the outside but trembling within. I told myself I was here for closure, nothing more. When the elevator doors opened, Daniel Weiss greeted me with the calm professionalism only lawyers seem to master. "Mrs. Harper," he said, "thank you for coming." His eyes, though polite, seemed to hold something, pity maybe or curiosity. The conference room was large, with glass walls overlooking the city. A mahogany table stretched across the center, polished to perfection. At the far end sat Nathan, immaculate as always, scrolling through his phone. He barely looked up when I entered. "Mother," he said flatly, the word sounding more like an obligation than a greeting. I nodded. "Nathan." Daniel took his place at the head of the table, opening a thick leather folder embossed with gold initials. T.K. Thomas Alexander Kane. The sight of that name made my chest tighten. "Shall we begin?" Daniel asked. Nathan leaned back, confident, already assuming how this would go. After all, he was the son, the heir, the public face of Kane Properties. I was merely the ghost of a marriage long buried. Daniel began to read, his voice steady and formal. "I, Thomas Alexander Kane, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this document as my last will and testament." The words blurred into legal phrasing, numbers, clauses, properties. Then came the first allocation. "To my son Nathaniel Kane, I leave the penthouse located at 742 Fifth Avenue, and the sum of $600,000. Nathan's lips curled into a faint, satisfied smile. The murmur of the assistant typing notes filled the silence. He nodded slightly, as though this outcome was no surprise. And then Daniel cleared his throat. His tone shifted. "To Evelyn Harper, my former wife." The room went still. Even the air seemed to pause. "I leave $39 million in liquid assets and 70% ownership of Kane Properties, including voting rights, patents, and intellectual property associated with current and future architectural projects." The silence that followed was absolute. Not a breath, not a sound. Even the assistant stopped typing. Nathan's face drained of color. Then, as if struck by lightning, he shot up from his chair. "What the hell did you just say?" he barked. Daniel repeated the clause, calm but firm. "Mr. Kane, the terms are exactly as written and verified. Mrs. Harper is the majority beneficiary." Nathan's voice rose to a shout. "This is insane. She manipulated him. She must have." I sat frozen, unable to speak. My mind raced, trying to comprehend the words I had just heard. $39 million. 70% of his company. It made no sense. Thomas and I hadn't spoken in nearly 2 decades. The man who had once called me the love of his life had also accused me of abandoning him. Why would he leave me everything? Daniel remained composed. Mr. Kane, I assure you, this document was signed and witnessed according to all legal protocols. It was updated 6 months ago. 6 months. Nathan's voice cracked with disbelief. 6 months before he died? That's when he was sick, when he wasn't even making sense. On the contrary, Daniel replied. I met with him personally. He was clear, deliberate, and adamant about his decision. Nathan turned to me. His face contorted with rage. What did you do to him, Mother? Did you go behind my back? Did you pretend to care just to get his money? The accusation struck like a slap. I felt my throat tighten, words trapped somewhere between guilt and shock. I didn't even know he was ill, I whispered. I haven't spoken to him since your wedding. Liar, he spat. You always show up when there's something to gain. I wanted to reach for him to remind him that once long ago he was a child who trusted me. But his eyes were his father's eyes, cold, wounded, impenetrable. Daniel stepped in. Mr. Kane, I understand this is difficult, but your father's wishes are legally binding. The shares, accounts, and properties will transfer to Mrs. Harper within 30 business days. Nathan slammed his fist against the table, sending papers fluttering. This isn't over. I'll contest it. Daniel didn't flinch. You are within your rights, but I must warn you, the will is airtight. Every page was notarized, every conversation recorded. Your father anticipated potential challenges. Nathan stared at him, then at me, his jaw trembling with fury. He didn't even like you. You left him. I swallowed hard. And yet, I said softly, he still remembered me. That only enraged him further. You don't deserve a cent. You weren't there for him. You weren't there for me. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I was there, Nathan, I said quietly. Just not in the way you wanted me to be. The room fell silent again. The city buzzed faintly beyond the glass walls, indifferent to the storm unraveling inside. When the meeting ended, I gathered my bag with shaking hands. Nathan stormed out without a word, his footsteps echoing down the marble hallway. I turned to Daniel. I don't understand, I whispered. Why would Thomas do this? Daniel hesitated, then looked at me with an expression that was neither shock nor confusion, something closer to knowing. Maybe, he said gently, it's not a question of why he did it, Mrs. Harper. Maybe it's a question of what he wanted you to find. And just like that, a chill ran through me. Because beneath the numbers and signatures I could feel it. This wasn't just an inheritance. It was a message. And Thomas Kane was still speaking to me from beyond the grave. Daniel reached into his leather briefcase and carefully drew out a cream-colored envelope, sealed with dark blue wax. My heart stilled the moment I saw the familiar handwriting on the front, Thomas A. Kane. Elegant, controlled, and unmistakably his. The wax had been pressed with the Kane family crest, the same one engraved on the marble fireplace of our old penthouse. This, Daniel said softly, was to be read only after the will. The room fell utterly silent again. Nathan's breathing was sharp and uneven, his hands gripping the edge of the table. I, on the other hand, could barely breathe. My eyes followed the slow motion of Daniel's fingers as he broke the seal and unfolded the paper. The faint rustle echoed in the glass room like a whisper from the past. When Daniel began to read, his voice was deep and steady, but what I heard was not his voice. It was Thomas's. The same calm, commanding tone that once filled our kitchen on Sunday mornings, softened only by regret. Evelyn, if you are hearing this, it means I have left this world, and all that remains of me are the choices I made, and the ones I didn't. I have lived long enough to build towers, but not long enough to mend what I broke between us. My fingers tightened around the edge of my chair. You once told me that the measure of a man isn't in what he owns, but in what he gives. I laughed then, too proud, too blind. But time has a cruel way of stripping pride away, layer by layer, until only truth remains. You were right, Evelyn. You always were. A lump rose in my throat. I could see him in my mind, sitting at his mahogany desk, the city lights reflecting off his glasses as he wrote. He must have been alone. Thomas was never good at being alone. I chose ambition over family. I believed power could fill the silence you left behind. I told myself I didn't need you. But every decision I made afterward was an echo of that loss. I built an empire to drown out your absence, but the higher I climbed, the emptier it became. Tears began to blur the words in front of me. Daniel's voice faded, and in my mind Thomas was right there. In the corner of the room, the way he used to stand when he was nervous, fingers brushing his cufflinks. You gave me the best years of your life, and I repaid you with neglect. You loved me when I was no one, but when the world began to love me, I forgot the woman who taught me what integrity meant. I forgot the sound of truth. My chest ached as though something long dormant had cracked open. Nathan looked away, his jaw tight. Evelyn, I know I can't ask for forgiveness, but I can leave you what I took for granted, the power I once misused. The fortune, the company, the influence. Use them as you see fit. Build something human out of what I turned into stone. At that line my tears spilled freely. I pressed my hands together, trying to steady the tremor in them. I had never imagined Thomas, the man of walls and control, could sound so vulnerable, even from beyond the grave. And to our son Nathan. The words seemed to hang in the air. Nathan's head lifted sharply, his eyes narrowing. My boy, you are brilliant just like your mother, though you refuse to admit it. You have my drive, my precision, and her heart, though you hide it behind anger. You were raised in comfort, not in truth. I gave you everything but wisdom. I told you your mother left us, but the truth is I pushed her away. She fought for this family longer than I deserved. Nathan's breath caught. His face hardened, but behind that steel something cracked. Son, the world won't always be kind, but it will test your soul. And when it does, I hope you'll remember what your mother stood for. That people matter more than profit, that truth outlasts reputation. You'll hate me now, maybe even longer. But someday when you stand at your own crossroads, you'll understand. Daniel's voice grew quieter. This letter is not a reward or an apology. It's an admission, the only honest one I've left to give. Evelyn, my final wish is simple. Let what destroyed us become what heals others. Love, Thomas. The last line landed like a whisper, fading into the hum of the city beyond the glass. For a long moment no one spoke. The ticking of the wall clock filled the silence, steady, merciless. I wiped my face, my fingertips trembling. I had dreamed of hearing an apology from Thomas, but never like this. Not through paper and ink. Not after he was gone. Across the table, Nathan's expression shifted from rage to disbelief, then something softer, almost pain. He stood abruptly, snatched the letter from Daniel's hand, and tore it in half. This is garbage, he shouted, his voice cracking. You think this makes up for anything? You think I'll let her steal everything my father built? Nathan, I tried to say, but he cut me off. I'll sue. I'll expose this fraud. You'll all see. He crumpled the torn pieces of the letter, threw them onto the polished floor, and stormed out. The door slammed shut, leaving a vacuum of silence behind him. I stared at the scraps of paper scattered near my feet. The ink, Thomas's words, still visible in torn fragments. Love, forgive, truth. My tears fell onto the floor, darkening the pieces until the words blurred completely. Daniel bent down quietly, gathering what was left of the letter. I'm sorry you had to hear it like this, he said softly. I shook my head. No, I whispered. I'm glad I did. For the first time he was honest. Maybe that's all I ever wanted. We sat there for a while, two people who barely knew each other, bound by the voice of a man who was gone. Outside, the sky had begun to clear. Shafts of light broke through the gray clouds and spilled across the city skyline, glinting against the glass towers Thomas once built. I looked out at the view, the empire he left behind, glittering yet hollow, and for the first time I didn't feel small in its shadow. He had left me more than money. He had left me a choice. And as I rose to leave, I knew what I would do with it. When I stepped out of Daniel's office, the city felt louder. The traffic on Madison Avenue roared like waves crashing against the shore, and Manhattan's skyline shimmered in the afternoon sun as if it too were watching me. This middle-aged woman holding a letter that had rewritten the past 20 years of her life. I walked aimlessly for a while, the wind tugging at my hair, the noise of the world blurring into silence inside my mind. $40 million. 70% of Kane Properties. The kind of numbers that could make headlines, ruin reputations, or build empires. But as I clutched that piece of paper, the one with Thomas's final words, I didn't feel victorious. I felt hollow. Money couldn't return the years I'd spent rebuilding myself from nothing. It couldn't erase the way Nathan looked at me at the funeral, like I was the villain of his story. So I did what I'd always done. I searched for meaning in the chaos. That night, I sat by the window of my small Brooklyn apartment, the same place I'd moved into after leaving Thomas. The air smelled faintly of rain and old paper. On the table lay the will, the lawyer's card, and Thomas's letter. I read his words again, slowly this time. He had called me the only person who ever reminded him of who he wanted to be. It hurt, because it was true. Thomas had built towers of glass and steel, but somewhere in the process, he had forgotten the foundation, the human part of himself. And I had walked away when I realized love wasn't enough to save him. Now, after all these years, he had tried to make amends in the only way he knew how. But I didn't need restitution. I needed peace. So I made a decision. The next morning, I called a financial advisor and set up a charitable trust, the Thomas and Evelyn Foundation. It would focus on education and housing for underprivileged children and the homeless, people like the ones I used to write about when I was still a journalist. People Thomas once said were someone else's problem. Now they would be our purpose. As the paperwork came together, I wrote a letter to Nathan. It took me 3 days to finish because every word felt like stitching an old wound. My son, I began. I don't need your father's money, nor do I want to fight you for what you think is yours. I only hope that one day you'll understand that walking away from your father wasn't an act of hate. It was an act of survival. I loved him, but I couldn't live in a world where love had to compete with ambition. I never stopped loving you. Not once. I've started something in both our names, a foundation that will hopefully do what your father and I could not, build something that lasts not out of pride but out of compassion. I'll be here if you ever want to talk. Mom. I sealed the envelope with trembling hands and sent it to his address uptown. He never replied. Not right away. But that was okay. Forgiveness, I had learned, cannot be rushed. Weeks passed. I began to see the world differently. Less like a battlefield and more like a garden that needed tending. Reporters tried to reach me when news of the will leaked, but I refused every interview. The story wasn't about money. It was about redemption. About learning to live with the ghosts of the people we once were. Sometimes on quiet evenings, I'd walk by the waterfront and imagine Thomas beside me. Not the powerful architect everyone admired, but the man who once held my hand under the rain in 1985, before fame and failure got in the way. And in those moments I didn't feel anger anymore. Just gratitude. Because even though our love didn't last, it shaped me into someone who could rebuild from ruins. And because of that, I could finally say goodbye not just to him but to the version of myself that spent years waiting to be seen. Manhattan glittered across the river like a promise I no longer needed to chase. For the first time in decades, I wasn't defined by what was taken from me, or by what was given back. I was defined by what I chose to do next. And I chose to begin again. Looking back, I realized that life had never been about what I gained or lost. It was about what I understood too late. The inheritance, the anger, the years of silence between me and Nathan. They were all mirrors, showing me the difference between power and peace. I learned that money can't save a lost soul. It can build skyscrapers and fund legacies, but it cannot rebuild a heart that's forgotten how to love. I learned that true wealth begins when you give, not when you count. Because every act of giving plants a seed that outlives you. I learned that children don't need empires, they need examples. They watch what we do far more than they hear what we say. Nathan didn't need a father's fortune or a mother's pride. He needed truth, grace, and time. And I learned that forgiveness isn't a gift for others. It's a release for yourself. It's the quiet moment when you stop wishing the past were different and start building something new from what remains. Finally, I realized that real love never dies. It waits, sometimes for decades, until we're strong enough to see it again through wiser eyes. If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe. Not for me, but for every mother who was ever misunderstood, yet still chose love over revenge.